There was a time when our people lived off the land. They lived in the forests in the winter. They gathered sweet sugar and fished in the spring. In the summer, they held ceremonies and gathered the bounty of Mother Earth. In the fall, they hunted and prepared for the long winters. They lived by the water and moved with the seasons.
Depending on the season, it was all about sustainment. What could sustain us in one area for so long? During the springtime, there was not a lot of farming going on. There could not be a lot of gathering. It was primarily fishing and preparation for the farming season. Need a sturdy home for our families to stay while the men went off on their month-long, 2-month-long hunting journeys.
My father always taught me that everything we need to survive, we can get from the land. We need to get back to the land and start taking care of her. And that in turn, she takes care of us. When time comes, we can pass it on to our children.
We had many different trade and travel routes. We'd actually hunt for months, and then we'd actually trade farther upriver for different stones or different tools that we did not have in our area to bring back to our families. Everything was an ongoing thing. You never had days off.
Everything started to change when the newcomers came. Soon, it became hard to travel with the seasons. The Long Knives, the Americans in the South, were hungry for land and they wanted to own all of Turtle Island. They attacked and burned many villages. The warriors had to fight to protect our people and our homelands.
The First Nations had been constantly having problems with American encroachment on their traditional lands. The Americans would often work out land deals where they would purchase large tracts of land from one particular tribe. And of course, what would happen is that this land would then be considered sold. But meanwhile, there were many other First Nations people that were living on that same land.
There was an onslaught of Euro-Western people coming, and they were coming over the Alleghenies. So many of them, they tried to keep peace with them, and they wrote treaties with the Americans, but they didn't hold those treaties. The promises they made, they didn't keep.
From the land of the Shawnee, a great man came forward and urged all First Nations to unite as one against the Americans. Tecumseh's vision inspired many followers from many nations.
Tecumseh was a Shawnee First Nations leader who brought together a variety of First Nations with a message of unity.
He was a very spiritual person. He was very generous. He had compassion even to the prisoners.
His vision was to preserve Indian territory, a territory that had been promised by the British for future generations.
His big thing was to make sure that the land belonged to everybody, and they kept their culture and definitely kept their language, because you can't understand land because you can't say it in English what it really means when you speak your language.
Tecumseh had been upset by the practice of First Nations to sell pieces of territory to the United States. He had a political message that the way to retain First Nations territory and the First Nations way of life was to unify into a confederacy.
We have to stop this from happening. We need to be united, not only in a defensive way to keep people from encroaching on our land, but we also have to be united so that we don't have one group selling land that belongs to all of us.
We are a great people. We're very peaceful people, and we'll only fight if they take our lands.
During the time of the Strawberry Moon, the Americans declared war on the British. They planned to attack and move north into our territories. They thought they would win easily because they had more soldiers and weapons. They called this the War of 1812, but we called it our fight for survival.
Tecumseh had a vision of unifying all tribes. It was like the bowl with one spoon. All lands belonged to all tribes.
And he centered this confederacy in what became the Western theater of the War of 1812. And he continued to have that vision of unity and a vision of preserving a large homeland where First Nations could continue to practice their way of life for generations and generations into the future.
The Americans were concerned that the First Nations would become allies of the British. They were fearful of the strength of the warriors. They knew that in the forests, the skill of one warrior could equal that of 3 soldiers.
That alliance centered, at least from Tecumseh's perspective, on a promise that First Nations would have that territory in the central Great Lakes and that it would be protected by the British Empire. The only way to stop American expansion was to unify and to not sign any more land cessions unless tribes and nations were united.
The Americans hired spies to deliver their war message. In Delaware, a spy named Ebenezer Allen read a proclamation urging the villagers to surrender to the Americans.
There were at least 3 spies that were hired by the Americans to come here and try to convince the settlers to side with the Americans, or at the very least to stay neutral. What they did was hire people to come to these little villages and read a proclamation. And the proclamation had been issued by the Americans to warn settlers not to fight alongside an Indian, not to ally themselves with the British, or they would suffer serious consequences.
If the barbarous and savage policy of Great Britain be pursued, and the savages are let loose to murder our citizens and butcher our women and children, this war will be a war of extermination. The first stroke with the tomahawk, the first attempt with the scalping knife will be the signal for one indiscriminate scene of desolation. No white man found fighting by the side of an Indian will be taken prisoner. Instant destruction will be his lot.
Tecumseh decided to support the British. General Brock promised Tecumseh that the British would reward the First Nations for their support with a separate homeland. Warriors began to gather and prepare for battle. Thousands of Chippewas, Winnebagos, Sacs, Shawnees, Wyandots, Mississaugas, Delawares, Potawatomis, Ojibways, Ottawas, Senecas, Dakotas, and many others came to support Tecumseh's vision. Some First Nations remained neutral, and others, for their own reasons, joined forces with the Americans. After the early victories, other nations from the east joined the battles.
There are many stories about Tecumseh. Some of them seem to err on the side of mythological.
Tecumseh really wanted to look at his own agenda, which was the protection of land. He wanted to push the Americans right back over the Alleghenies.
They had to decide who to support in the war. It wasn't easy for First Nations to decide. It wasn't just an overnight decision to support the British. First Nations had so much at stake, more so than the Americans, more so than the British, because this was their traditional territory and this was their homeland.
Our reason for allying ourselves with the British would give us lands.
This land was key in the war between Americans and the British. And at that time, the Anishinaabe had to figure out a way, which was the lesser of 2 evils, to try and ensure their rights and their livelihood to live on the land.
Many of the First Nations had already joined forces. The Chippewa, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations together formed one of the most powerful political and military alliances in the Great Lakes region.
The Three Fires Confederacy was started back in the 700, and that was the protection of the Great Lakes because that's where our homeland was.
The Three Fires Confederacy, you have to understand, as a First Nations confederacy, had been expanding territorially for the last couple hundred years. But one political center of the Council of the Three Fires during the War of 1812 was Fort Detroit.
Detroit was very interesting because it had been a French fort, and then it was a British fort, and then it was ceded to the Americans in the late 1790s. And it was a major military and commercial center. When war was declared, Detroit was a very strategically important point.
Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, had founded a large village called Prophetstown on the banks of the Tippecanoe River. When Tecumseh was away, Governor Harrison and his men attacked the village. They burnt it to the ground. When Tecumseh returned and saw his village destroyed, he knew that he must keep fighting against the Americans.
It really started at the Battle of Tippecanoe, which was in a village that Tecumseh had founded with his brother. It was a place for all nations to come together, and the Americans under Harrison decided to attack that village when Tecumseh was traveling south promoting his vision. They burnt it to the ground, and it did not destroy Tecumseh's vision. It actually gave him a greater resolve to fight the Americans.
Tecumseh said that strength would come from unity. He said that many branches tied together were stronger than one. The British needed the First Nations to win battles. Our ancestors were skillful and smart, and the Americans knew this. They were afraid of the First Nations warriors, and that is why they surrendered at the Battle of Michilimackinac. Hundreds of warriors came in war canoes on open waters. They came from all directions. Chief Shingwak led warriors from the north. The Americans surrendered without a fight. Then they moved on to one of our greatest victories in the war.
The Americans initially sent a column under General Hull to reinforce Detroit and come into southwestern Ontario and to capture that area.
William Hull had people counting the First Nations warriors. The American forces at Fort Detroit didn't know how many British regulars there were, and there were hardly any.
Hull had a tremendous fear of First Nations warriors, and Tecumseh, along with Brock, were able to convince him that they had tremendous more person power than they actually had.
Tecumseh had First Nations people go back and forth in front of the gates, and they were counting the same warriors over and over again. So William Hull had the perception that, oh my God, there's thousands, there's maybe tens of thousands of Native warriors just outside the fort.
And before they were even able to launch an attack on the fort, Hull surrendered. So it was an incredible victory. I mean, when you think of it, there were very few lives lost and a tremendous strategic victory.
Young warriors, such as Frederick Fisher, had helped in the victory at Fort Detroit. He scouted the fort while swimming behind a log in the Detroit River. After that great victory in Detroit, the Americans were worried. They had expected to win every battle. Capturing Michilimackinac and Detroit meant military control of the upper Great Lakes, control of supply lines, and control of the trade routes. But the tide changed. Tecumseh's friend, General Brock, died in battle at Queenston Heights. Then the Americans won a battle on the waters of Lake Erie. The British could no longer send supplies to Amherstburg. The Americans built up their military and planned their invasion into our territories.
After the Battle of Erie, Proctor had problems. He figured he didn't have enough men, he didn't have the supplies, didn't have the rations they would need for war. But Tecumseh had about 10,000 people warriors ready to fight, and they were all located right along Gros Seal Isle and all up and down, and there was thousands of canoes there. Proctor didn't really trust the Indians. He didn't really like them. So he didn't really communicate with Tecumseh like in a strategic way.
Waterways were the highways. Control of the waterways meant that you controlled transportation, and whoever controlled the lake had control of that supply line. And so when they met at Put-in-Bay and the Battle of Lake Erie took place, and because the Americans won, they now had the ability to stop supplies coming from Niagara to Amherstburg.
One of the things that the warriors had over everybody else was that you didn't have to train them. They were all good hunters. They would do a lot of camouflage, and they did what they call scrimmage type battling.
They took advantage of the landscape, the tree cover, and basically utilized the surrounding environment much more to create an effective defense.
A First Nations leader during the War of 1812 was in a vulnerable position because it was very, very different than how European armies came together.
Well, I think they differed in two major ways. There was the tactical difference. The British had very structured ways of fighting. They would have the line, the infantry line, where they would be lined up side to side or in sometimes a square.
In these standing armies that the U.S. and the British each had during the War of 1812, regulars in those standing armies had no choice but to join those armies, or they'd be breaking the law, or they'd be deserting. Authority flowed through a hierarchy.
Both the British and the Americans had generals, and those generals were appointed by the President of the United States or by King George III. There was a very structured command system, whereas, of course, with the First Nations, the chiefs were all basically independent people.
The situation was entirely different for First Nations. There was no hierarchy that compelled people to join a cause or to join a battle. Warriors actually did that on their own accord.
That was a much more challenging way to keep a military group in order, and I think it really attests to the skill that Tecumseh had in being able to do that.
Tecumseh was a great military leader because he had this ability to speak. When he walked into the room, he had the air of a leader.
What Tecumseh had to do was believe in his message so strongly and speak about it so passionately and be willing to make so many personal sacrifices to see his vision through that he had to serve as an example all the time to bring this Confederacy together.
The British could not replace the military leadership of General Brock when he was killed. They appointed General Proctor to become their new leader. He made poor decisions, and he did not have the respect of the First Nations.
Proctor was a cautious, sort of pudgy older fellow, and I don't think that there was that presence that Brock had, that manliness or confidence of command that Brock exuded and that Tecumseh exuded as well. From a personality point of view, there was not that commonality that Tecumseh had with Brock.
Tecumseh wanted to make a stand and fight the Americans, but Proctor decided to retreat up the Thames River. Thousands of warriors and their families left with British soldiers and settlers. As they retreated, they burnt their own buildings and crops. Cold, hungry, and tired, they left with the American army in close pursuit. But they had to keep moving. It was a long and painful journey.
The reason Henry Proctor decided to start retreating was because of a British Navy defeat in Lake Erie that cut off the supplies to Henry Proctor and to the 10,000 or so native peoples who were living around Fort Amherstburg and Boblo Island.
He didn't even tell Tecumseh that he was retreating. Tecumseh showed up one day at Fort Malden. All of a sudden, they were destroying the fort. So Tecumseh spoke to his warriors, and a lot of them left.
You had this mass exodus, and because it was inland, they had to basically take bridle paths. This retreat column stretched so far. I mean, it was miles and miles long. They tried to take far too many possessions. They had wagons. They were trying to move their livestock. It was really way over the top.
Tecumseh had a sister, and her name was Tecumseh. He was very, very close to his sister. When the retreat was on from Detroit, and they were retreating up the Thames, she was there with the women and the children following the warriors as they were being followed by the Americans and forced up the Thames River.
There was a smaller battle in what's now Tecumseh Park in Chatham. 2 Kentuckians died in that battle. There wasn't enough time for Proctor to create proper battleground.
Tecumseh had been told that the British would make a defensive stand there, that it was a good strategic place to make a defensive stand. When he arrived, he found nothing prepared. So he was very angry about that. What he decided to do was to make a defensive stand of his own. Tecumseh's idea was, we've got to slow this American advance down. And so he was probably successful to some degree in slowing them down. They were able to burn a mill that was just up the road to keep it from falling into American hands.
Tecumseh also had a good relationship with the Arnold family, and it was also rumored that the Arnold mill was saved because Chief Tecumseh said not to burn it. Other mills in our area were burned because we were retreating from the Americans. We didn't want them to get the supplies. So the Arnolds took their millstones out of that mill and hid them, and it made the mill look like it was inoperable. So when the Americans came through, they just took it as a mill that wasn't finished yet, and it wasn't burnt.
There was a village along the Thames River called Fairfield. Some Delawares lived there with the Moravian missionaries. They had built a fine settlement with cabins, farms, buildings. Life was prosperous and peaceful, but the war changed all that. After the Battle of the Thames, the Americans destroyed and burnt their village.
So then that the Lenape people were massacred so much that they were forced inland, the Ohio area, and then they split. Some of them split, went south to Oklahoma, and then the other ones came north to Canada.
Fairfield was the largest community, and they had a lot of fields, a lot of farmland. They supplied food and produce for a lot of the settlers and to even the people down in Sandwich and Amherstburg.
Just before the village of Fairfield, the warriors and the British decided to take a stand against the Americans.
The British had originally wanted to make it as far as Fairfield, which was a Moravian mission village, and they thought that that would be a good defensive place. But for reasons unknown to us, they decided to choose a spot a couple of kilometers further west of Fairfield.
During this hasty retreat, about half of the native warriors who were following Tecumseh had left. That has to do with the military leadership practices of First Nations. Many people were interpreting what seemed like betrayal on the part of the British because of Proctor's retreat. There were only perhaps about 500 native warriors at the Battle of the Thames.
So the British formed 2 lines of soldiers. Unfortunately, because there weren't that many soldiers, they were spaced fairly far apart. The normal British line is that they're right against each other, but here they were about 3 feet apart. The First Nations, in my opinion, much more wisely, decided to take up positions in the marsh, where they had the tree cover where it was very hard for cavalry to be able to get in at them.
So that left Tecumseh in the swamp in his area, and he had about 400 or 500 men. Within 2 hours, they actually lost the battle. Tecumseh was shot, and he passed right there.
What was probably the final blow is that Tecumseh was killed in the battle. That word spread very quickly, and once word spread and they saw this overwhelming American advance coming towards them, they eventually dispersed into the woods.
They were able to win the war at the Battle of the Thames, but Tecumseh, by standing his ground, really did stop the Americans from moving any further into Upper Canada, so the Americans didn't go any further, and they did retreat back to Fort Detroit.
After that happened, all the alliances sort of broke up, and they went back to their homes, and some of them went up to Burlington Heights.
The British retreated and left 500 First Nations warriors to fight over 3,500 Americans. War chiefs such as Tecumseh, Oshawana, Black Hawk, Nawash, and Robert Dixon led warriors from many nations into the battle. The Americans included many powerful leaders who used their reputations as Indian fighters to gain political office. Questions still remain about their involvement. Was this war really between the Americans and the First Nations? Did Tecumseh make a stand at the Battle of the Thames to keep the Americans out of unceded First Nations territory? What really happened to Tecumseh after the battle? We may never know.
Proctor was looking out for the well-being of the civilians. He was looking at it from a strategic point of view, probably a very rational point of view, that they didn't have enough manpower, that his soldiers were weary and tired. And I mean, these British soldiers were paid, they were employees, they were hired to defend an area and to obey orders. But it wasn't their land. They didn't have the passion. They weren't abandoning their homeland the way Tecumseh and the First Nations, and to a lesser degree the settlers that were here were doing. It wasn't the same sort of thing. So there wasn't that passion to fight and keep the land.
The Thames River past the Battle of the Thames area was still unceded Aboriginal territory, and that's where Tecumseh made a stand. So I think there's some significance in that. He actually did decide to make a stand right at the border of territory that had been agreed to be shared with the British for cultivation, for settlement. And as the Americans tried to move into unceded Indigenous territory, Tecumseh decided to make his stand.
Finally, the war came to an end. The Americans and the British signed the Treaty of Ghent, but once again, the British disappointed the First Nations. First Nations did not receive their promised homeland.
The Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24th, 1814, between the British and the Americans, and it ended the War of 1812. Before, when the war had started and Brock and Tecumseh had first met, Brock had promised Tecumseh that he would help establish a separate homeland for First Nations, all First Nations that wanted to come if they supported the British. And that promise was not honored.
When we wonder why there was such resistance on the part of Tecumseh and the other chiefs in terms of retreating, well, they were looking at retreat as potentially losing that dream of that independent homeland that they had.
I guess you could say that there's been a long period, maybe 7 generations, you could say, since the end of the War of 1812, when First Nations have been trying to restore that relationship. And there's been a long, dark period in between now and that war.
Soon, many more newcomers were moving into the First Nation territories. The Caldwell Nation warriors fought with
Colonel William Caldwell
during the war. When their warriors returned home to Pelee Island, they found that their lands had been lost to settlers. The Delawares eventually returned and settled on the southern banks of the Thames River. Many of the Potawatomi people settled at Walpole Island, bringing ponies that had been used during the War of 1812. The ponies were there for over 100 years. The Chippewas of the Thames signed the Longwoods Treaty in 1819, a treaty that included the land where Tecumseh and the warriors refused to let the Americans invade. 200 years after the war, Canada recognized the contributions of First Nations.
I was honored to be the representative of Chippewa of the Thames to accept this medal and banner of the Chippewa of the Thames people who fought in this war, I felt very proud to be chosen to accept this medal and banner. And I know the significance of this part in history had a very important role in the creation of Canada.
The Tecumseh Monument here on Walpole Island was built in 1931. The Veterans Association started pushing for a monument to serve as a final resting place for Tecumseh's bones in the 1920s. That's when some bones were discovered that the public suddenly had a great interest in as possibly being Tecumseh's bones. And these were the same bones that, according to Walpole Island's oral history, John Noddy had brought to Walpole Island in the 1840s.
In my opinion, we would not have been able to defend this area as well as we did up until 1813 had it not been for Tecumseh and his warriors. They were really the driving force behind the capture of Detroit and behind several of the actions in Ohio, and they played a huge role in the defense of this part of Canada.
There is a very good chance, a very good possibility, that Canada may not have existed as a country today if the First Nations had not supported the British in the War of 1812.
The end of the War of 1812 for Native peoples is perhaps an unfinished chapter, and so if this is the era of reconciliation, then we're perhaps moving towards a restored relationship where maybe First Nations aren't the losers of that war, but I think it still remains to be seen even today.
We're at a time now that the First Nation Indian people need to begin to speak out and talk about the protection of Mother Earth. And so all of our young people must be educated about our culture, about our language, and then we won't lose our identity.
The War of 1812 is a very, very important part of our history because it defines who we are.
My father, all the values and beliefs that he instilled in me that need to be instilled in everybody, in all of our people, in all of our youth.
When it's actually brought to light what's really happened and what really occurred, it really awakens something in them. It lets them know that their background is a lot more detailed than they really think that was actually taught in schools, because a lot of the stuff right now is not taught in schools. It has to be brought back from the elders and stories and traditions.
First Nations today have not forgotten the sacrifices of our ancestors that were made in the War of 1812. Almost every First Nation today has some kind of marker, whether it's a road sign, a monument, a building, to honor the role that our ancestors played in the War of 1812. It's something that's very significant. The sacrifices that they made for our people were enormous, and we must never forget that.
Today, many of our First Nations remember the War of 1812. The Three Fires Confederacy remembers Tecumseh and the warriors through sacred songs, ceremony, and dance. Monuments, buildings, roads, there are many reminders of the sacrifices our ancestors made to protect our lands and our people. Many died on the battlefield. Now, 7 generations have passed, and we must not forget.